Good afternoon, all participants. Welcome to the session 3B, Equity-Based Budgeting and Decentralization of Financial System for Reducing Inequalities. My name is Maki Hayashikawa, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this very pertinent session. Please allow me first to introduce our distinguished panel. For this session, we have 4 speakers. First, we have Mr. Stephen Fraser, the Deputy Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation. He works across all areas of EEF's activity and leads the development of global partnerships, collaborating with educators and policymakers to translate evidence into practice. Our second speaker is Dr. Marianne Persoons. She's an advisor of international policy at the Department of Education and Training of the Flemish community of Belgium. She is currently the national representative to the Council of Europe Steering Committee of Educational Policy and Practice, and to several OECD, UNESCO, and Benelux working parties, as well as the UN SDG 4 Education 2030 Steering Committee. Our third speaker is Mr. Jun Fan, social policy specialist and serving as a regional PFM coordinator at UNICEF East Asia Pacific Region Office. Prior to his position here, he was Chief Social Policy and Child Protection at UNICEF Botswana Country Office, overseeing and managing the office's upstream social policy dialogue with the host government in child poverty, social protection, and child protection. And our fourth speaker is Associate Professor Dr. Chayut Punyasavasut, the Associate Professor of Economics at the Faculty of Economics, Thammasat University here in Thailand. He is currently serving as a head researcher on implementing the conditional cash transfer for the Equitable Education Fund, Thailand. So let us begin with Mr. Stephen Fraser from the Education Endowment Foundation for his presentation. Please, Mr. Stephen.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. We are a charity based in the UK, and we were set up 9 years ago now with the goal of helping close the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their more affluent peers. And we set about using evidence to achieve that goal. We were set up by a partnership of existing charities, and you can see their logos up on the page there. But fundamentally, our role is to help people make better decisions that lead to better outcomes for disadvantaged pupils. So far, in the 9 years that we've existed, we've funded 190 different projects. We've spent £115 million of the £125 million that we were started with. And we've worked with over half of all of the schools in the UK and over 1.6 million pupils. And I'll talk a bit about our work and how it relates to making better decisions about the allocation of resources to close the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and their peers. Now, the context of this work is really important. As I said, our charity is based in the UK, and the English school system uses what we call pupil premium funding. And this is funding given by the government to individual schools based on the number of children who are eligible for free school meals in each of their schools. And it's a different amount for primary schools and secondary schools, slightly more for primary schools, about £1,200, and slightly less for secondary schools, about £900. But what's interesting, I think, about this context of equity-based budgeting is that it mirrors what's happened in a number of other countries. So within the Australian context, which is where I'm from, I work in the English system now, but equity-based funding based on multiple measures of student need also exists in the Welsh context. The Pupil Development Grant has been initiated there. In Scotland, the Pupil Equity Funding, which is also based on free school meal eligibility of pupils. All of these systems are designed to give funding directly to schools based on the concentration of need in their community using a range of individual pupil measures. And what's fascinating, I think, about all of these policy contexts is that the funding has been given directly to the school with autonomy over the decision-making for how that funding is spent, but with a clear targeting of the funding focused on disadvantaged pupils and closing the poverty-related attainment gap. And we think evidence is really important to supporting the decision-making in schools. helping school leaders and teachers make better decisions, more impactful decisions that lead to better outcomes for disadvantaged pupils. So that's what we've spent the last 9 years doing as an organisation. We aim to work with evidence in 3 key ways. To, number one there, synthesise the existing evidence base, to start with what we know and put the existing knowledge of the impact of different interventions and approaches into the hands of teachers so that they can make better funding allocation decisions. We aim to generate new knowledge, and we aim to mobilise, to move that knowledge around the system. And I'm going to talk briefly about how we do each of those things. The first point there, synthesising evidence, starting with what we know. The reason we do this is because we think the average classroom teacher, the average school leader, doesn't have the time in their day to read through research reports, journals, archives, and summarise the existing evidence base for themselves. So we think it's a really helpful starting point if we can play a role working in partnership with other organisations to summarise the information in really accessible ways. And we do that in 3 ways. The first way is we aim to summarise the impact or the effect of different intervention. And we do that using the standardized mean difference, which we convert into months of gain, months of learning progress. And as I said before, this is over and above the average 12 months progress that we would expect a child to make in a given year. The example that I've got at the bottom of the screen here, arts participation, on average, you can see there that when implemented well, arts participation interventions, the evidence shows, lead to an additional 2 months progress on average for pupils. The second way that we aim to summarise the evidence is the average cost. So is this an expensive intervention to deliver? Is it a cheap intervention? And we use a symbol, a system of pound signs there. So arts participation, £2, £2 signs out of a possible 5. That's a relatively low cost intervention. And then finally, we aim to summarise the security of the evidence. To what extent has this approach been studied multiple times? Have the results been replicated? Are there consistent findings? And we use a system of padlocks. So 3 padlocks here for arts participation out of a possible 5, indicating a moderate strength of evidence that educators, school leaders, teachers, policymakers should have a moderate level of confidence in the evidence about arts participation. Now, once we've done that for one intervention or one family of approaches, we can do it for lots of others. And this slide shows 35 types of interventions that we've summarised the evidence for in that way. And you can see there that there's a range of different costs and evidence strength, security, and different impacts. Now, this isn't about telling educators or policymakers how to spend their needs-based funding, but it's about equipping them with the knowledge of the average impact that different interventions tend to have, and then supporting those professionals to use that information alongside their own professional judgment, alongside their knowledge of the children and communities that they're working with to make better decisions. And this is all available in a public website. The Teaching and Learning Toolkit is what we call it. And the aim is to make this information very accessible so that school leaders and decision makers can make better decisions about the impact of their funding. The second thing that we aim to do, we know that schools are innovative places. They're always trying new things, different approaches. But often what's left as a result of that work is a legacy of activity, of doing things, but not necessarily a legacy of knowledge, of knowing what impact these things had. And so we aim to use our funding that we're privileged to have custody of to test the impact of these different interventions, to add that to the existing evidence base that we've already summarised. And we do that in exactly the same way as the synthesis activity. So on this slide, you can see a range of interventions that we have tested, 6 different types of interventions there, from tutoring to literacy and numeracy catch-up to early years interventions. And we summarise the impact of those in a very similar way. So the average cost, the average strength of the findings, and the average impact on pupils' attainment. And over on the right hand of this slide, you can see an example of a tutoring intervention that we've tested at relatively low cost, relatively strong evidence and strong impact for pupils. And again, this adds to the knowledge base to help educators make better decisions to help close that attainment gap. The third way that we work is to try and move that knowledge around the system. We know that simply summarising the existing evidence base and generating new knowledge isn't enough to change practice. It takes a lot for teachers to learn the skills to do different things. And we have learned over the years, and I'm sure this will be familiar to many people watching this, that teachers listen to other teachers. The trust between teaching professionals is very strong. And so we've aimed to set up a network of what we call research schools that are a partnership between ourselves and the Institute for Effective Education at the University of York to help mobilise that knowledge, to spread it around the system. And we work in quite close partnership with those schools to put the evidence in their hands and then to support them to work with their colleagues to build the professional capacity and expertise to work differently in more evidence-informed ways. The final piece I want to touch on is some guidance that we've developed for bringing that evidence together to help guide schools' decisions about the allocation of that equity-based funding, the pupil premium funding here in the English school system. We have adopted what we call a tiered model of spending that funding, where we think there is strong evidence to direct the bulk of that funding towards improving the quality of day-to-day teaching that every student experiences. So investing in the professional development of teachers, investing in the recruitment and retention of capable and expert teachers, and supporting particularly early career stage teachers to build up their professional expertise and capacity very quickly and support them so that they stay in the system rather than risk losing them to other professionals. The second level of this tier is very targeted academic support, so structured interventions, small group tuition, one-to-one interventions. And then thirdly, to think about wider school improvement strategies, so approaches to behaviour, feeding children through breakfast clubs, and strategies to increase attendance. And there's strong evidence for this tiered approach. The first piece of evidence comes from a summary of the interventions that are described in our teaching and learning toolkit. So I mentioned there that we summarise the evidence across 35 different types of interventions. When we take that evidence of impact and we rank order it from highest impact to lowest impact, and this chart shows exactly that rank ordering, what we tend to see are clusterings of interventions where the highest impact, and the two on the far left-hand side of this chart relate to feedback and developing students' metacognition and self-regulation, are quite close to the interactions between children and adults. They are improved in the classroom through those quite intimate interactions between teachers and pupils. We also see very high impacts on the left-hand side here again. Early years interventions, one-to-one tuition, collaborative learning approaches, peer tutoring, all of these are quite close to the instructional core, where learning happens. As we move from left to right across this chart, we start to move away from the classroom. We get to interventions that are delivered outside of the school, so sports participation, summer schools, extended school time, looking at after-school programs. So we're moving further away from the classroom and the interactions between teaching and children. And as we move even further away, we get to aspiration interventions, teacher performance pay. These are interventions that are a long way from getting to the heart of the teaching and learning relationship. And so we think this gives us really strong ground to privilege when we spend that equity-based funding to focus on improving the quality of day-to-day teaching. The third lesson here is that implementation really matters. We can take the most evidence-based approach in the world and implement it poorly, and we will have poor outcomes. So we think focusing on not only what the money is spent on and ensuring that's as evidence-based as possible, but then supporting school leaders and teachers to implement well. And you'll find on our website a practitioner or a school's guide to implementation, which summarises the implementation science to support that evidence to have traction in the school and maximise the impact. The final point I want to make is that we are increasingly seeing this evidence have relevance in a global context. And we're really proud to be working with a number of organisations globally, each of which is grappling with this question of how to spend money most effectively to improve outcomes for disadvantaged pupils. And so we're working at the moment in Australia with partners in Latin America, in Cameroon, in Jordan, and in Spain and here in the UK to help do that. So I hope that's given a really high level snapshot of why we think evidence is important for ensuring that as much as funding for targeted towards disadvantaged pupils is important, we think the way that funding is spent is even more important, and evidence can help inform that decision making in a way that leads to improvements for pupils. And we do have a strong track record here in the UK of that playing out. We can't claim as a charity to have sole responsibility for the improvements that we've seen in the UK, but we have seen small incremental improvements in closing the attainment gap over the last 10 years. Now, unfortunately, the situation we're all in globally at the moment with COVID-19 puts those gains at risk. And our priority, as I'm sure is all of yours, is to ensure that we don't let this global crisis undo the good work that's taken place over the last decade. So thank you for listening and your time. My details are on this final slide, or our organisational details. And it's been a pleasure to have this chance to speak with you and be part of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. For the next speaker, we have Ms. Marianne Persons from the Flemish Department of Education and Training. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here. Thanks to the Thai government and the organizers. My presentation will have roughly 4 parts. I will start from the global perspective. Then I will say something about the general policy context of the education in the region of my country for which I work. Then we go to the topic of this presentation, that's the socioeconomic status as basis for monitoring of education and equitable funding. And then we will dwell shortly on the lessons learned and the remaining challenges. I start with a quote from the Global Education Meeting that was convened by UNESCO and hosted by Belgium in Brussels in 2018, where the ministers of education and the international community held a very strong plea for disaggregated data to better tracking of inequalities based on the social status of learners. This message was summarized by the SDG Education 2030 Steering Committee when they addressed the high-level political forum of the UN in July 2019. And they captured this under a slogan, beyond averages. It's not enough that we know where a country in average stands in terms of educational performance. We have to make sure that we leave no one behind and that we know exactly who is left behind and what that person's social background is. I will say something about the policy context in my country. You might know that Belgium is a federal country, that we have 3 ministries of education according to the linguistic community. We have 3 national languages, and each national language has their ministry. I come from the Flemish Department of Education and Training, and that's roughly the ministry that looks at schools and universities and other educational institutions where the main instruction language is Dutch. Other ministries, they cater for the French-speaking schools or the German-speaking schools. But nonetheless, we have a Belgian constitution that keeps the education systems very close to each other, that looks at coherence in the qualifications frameworks. There is a common regulation on the duration of studies and on compulsory education, which is 13 years from age 5 to 18. And there is a concept of freedom of education, which has to do with freedom to organize education, freedom to choose schools, and rules on cost-free education, which are common to the Belgian territory as a whole. If we go to the trends that we have, well, we have the global trends. They are not different from the rest of the world. Rapid changes, growing diversity, the globalization in general. We have, and that's maybe specific, important demographic changes. We have an increase of the birth rate and the school age population going up. We have quite many newly arrived immigrants, and we had also a refugee crisis in 2015. There is consequently pressure on the public budget, especially education budget, and we have serious school capacity problems in the urban areas with which we cope, but still ask for a lot of attention. Just a few graphs on the demographic challenges, where you can see that we have upward trends. This is for pre-primary, this is for primary, and this is for secondary education, so rapid increase. What is typical for the education system? The freedom of choice and institutional autonomy as a key value. So there is large school autonomy, also for the curriculum and the recruitment of staff. There is freedom of education in the sense that, in fact, any legal person can set up a school, free or private, and even apply for funding if they comply with regulation. This means that we have hardly any privately funding education in Flanders and in Belgium as a whole. We have freedom of choice by the parents, also of institutions. You're not obliged to go to a school immediately in your neighborhood. You can go wherever you want. And there is open access. There are hardly any entrance exams for higher education, even no tuition in pre-primary, in primary, in secondary, and rather low tuition in higher and adult education. But now we come to the more important aspect. We have, in average, good student performance according to international comparison, but very serious concerns about inequalities. And we see this not only via the large-scale learning assessments like PISA, OECD's PISA, but also we see underrepresented groups in higher education, which is also a very good indicator of inequality. Since 2008, we tried to tackle this problem with a new system. We had already a system of tracking that started in 2002, but not so sophisticated. But since 2002, we have a monitoring on the basis of indicators for socioeconomic situation of students and school. It ranges from pre-primary to higher education. It's in fact tracking of individuals and their school performance through connected databases. Then it's a basis for general funding of pre-primary, primary, and secondary schools, and it influences operational budget and teaching hours. The more vulnerable students you have in your school, the higher your funding will be. It's informing social inclusion policies in higher education. It's also connected to other thematic monitoring, and there are synergies with dedicated funding for equal educational opportunities, for instance, for refugees or newly arrived immigrants, special needs education, and education for vulnerable adult learners that sometimes struggle with literacy. What are the main indicators we use? There are 5. That's language spoken at home. That's a proxy for cultural origin and migrant background mainly. The level of education of the mother. That's a proxy for family education and social background. In Belgium, we know from research that the level of education of the mother is even more significant than that of the father. The unemployment or employment status of the parents, the neighborhood of residence, and then the entitlement to means tested study grant, which is a proxy for families' financial situations. Because if you have a lower family income, as we know from the tax administration, then you are entitled to have a grant, and that's about 25% of our learning population. There are other monitoring processes connected to this system and also using the indicators. I list a few. It's the electronic monitoring of enrollments in crowded urban areas where we have to take measures to give everybody a place at school. And there we try to find a balance between parental choice of parents, and having a social mix, and the indicators are very useful for that. And so we can try to avoid school segregation, which is not always easy. Early school leaving is tracked like that, absenteeism in compulsory education, regular attendance at pre-primary. Pre-primary is free of charge, but still we see that some vulnerable groups don't go every day. The use of ICT at school, we have the capacity monitor of the school infrastructure, and we can also track the transition between secondary and higher education and the transition to the labor market, see what kind of profiles are more due to not find a job and go into unemployment. So the system is, of course, a good example of how to chart the totality of your learners. But there are still serious challenges which I would like to share with you. In 2015, the OECD carried out a review on school resources in Flanders, and they pointed at the following connected strengths and challenges. And they made recommendations that have informed legal reforms in school funding ever since up till today. On the one hand, it's so that we have a high level of autonomy for schools in using resources. That's positive. In general, the resources are not earmarked. There is a maximum flexibility on how to use them. But this has also risks. And the risks are that there is not enough information and data on the resource use and input. We have no clear view on the structure of resource use in schools, input, and the reporting by the schools on resource output remains at a very general level. And another weakness is that there is an imbalance in the distribution of funding across the levels of education. The overall spending is significantly higher in secondary than in pre-primary and primary education. And what we have been trying now is to remediate these two challenges concerning the imbalance. and channeling more resources to pre-primary and primary, we have made already quite some progress. But on having a better view on the efficient use of the budget for equal educational um, opportunities. The challenges are bigger because we don't want to destroy the autonomy of the schools too much. But on the other hand, we would like to have more information and be a bit more efficient and measure this efficiency. And this is something for which we have to dialogue with the schools and what we do, but that will take, of course, a little bit more time. So I thank you for your attention and I remain open for your further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Marianne Persons. For the next speaker, we have Mr. Jun Fan from UNICEF.
Good afternoon, colleagues. So I'll start with a quick check on the concept that we are talking about. What really do we mean? What we really mean by equity? Here in UNICEF, equity means all children have an equal opportunity to survive, develop, and reach their full potential. It is really a concept about equitable access to opportunities. And equity in education, we believe, is particularly important because that helps to ensure that equity in other dimensions would be achieved by all, as education helps increase the ability of children and their caregivers to access opportunities when they do arise. So then, in terms of inequalities in education spending, uh, it can take different forms. This is an example and an obvious one. This is from Kenya, where I worked. Uh, the per capita spending on education across different counties in the country really vary significantly. And the highest county spends more than 4 times the lowest county. And it also varies significantly across counties in terms of the education spending as a percentage of total spending, public spending at county level. And the difference actually here is more than 4 times as the per capita spending in absolute amounts. And definitely it raises concern over policymakers over equity. Now it can take a different form like this one. This is from Botswana, where I also worked in my past life. Uh, the as you can see, the per unit cost, that is per student cost, of primary education, secondary, junior secondary education, senior secondary education, tertiary education across different levels of education varies greatly in the country. And basically, the tertiary education unit cost is almost 30 times of that of primary education. And such ratio is far greater than what we observe from other or average upper middle income countries. So therefore, definitely it will have equity implications as as well. Now, if we think about equitable based budgeting and decentralization, I think we possibly need to start with some key considerations or principles. How, what would guide us in a design of such a system that is equitable based? The first important principle is called subsidiary principle. It basically means a particular service is best to be delivered by the lowest level of government that is capable of delivering it. And the assumption is that the local governments are closer to the people and therefore they understand best the real needs and interests of the people at local level. And therefore, as long as they have the capacity to deliver a particular type of service, they should be charged with this responsibility to do so. Then the second important consideration here is finance follows functions. That basically means financial resource is assigned to a government agency or a subnational government only when it has clearly defined service responsibilities to deliver. For example, if education is the responsibility of a district government, then the district government will be given the financial resources for delivering education, basic education responsibilities. Otherwise, it should not have that kind of financial resources at all. Then the third important consideration, I believe, is to be clear. Equity at what level? Are we talking about outcome level, output level, or input level equity? I think it is very easy to look at this at input level, that everybody is receiving, for example, more or less the same things, whether in terms of in kind or in terms of money. But I think that possibly is not the best interpretation we can have here. And because in the end, what we are concerned about is really how students are doing in school and what does that mean to uh, their performance outside of school, to their well-being along their life down the road. Then the fourth consideration here is a balance between equity and efficiency and effectiveness. Uh, Equity should not undermine efficiency and effectiveness. And when we are talking about equity, we are really not talking about equally bad outcome for everybody so that everybody is the same. No, we are not talking about that. The last important thing, I think, is the operational capacities. Uh, we can have very subtle and complicated arrangements to make sure or try to make sure that every aspect of equity is taken care of. And I've personally seen uh, very delicate arrangements trying to really take into account every possible contributor to inequity and try to deal with that individually, one by one, in the design of a system in terms of resource resource allocation, not only for education but for other sectors as well. But most of the time, these complicated schemes do not work very well, largely because of the constraints on capacities by the implementing partners, especially the implementing government agencies. So sometimes we say simple is beautiful. Uh, then, given the time, I think I would want to really focus a bit on intergovernmental transfer system because I think this could be also most relevant for Thailand as well. As I understand, education responsibility is a shared responsibility between the central and the local governments in the country. And therefore, such a system, the design of such a system would really be essential to ensure the quality delivery of services. Then, in terms of the instrument for intergovernmental transfers or intergovernmental finance, usually we use grants, I believe, and but we could have different types of grants, unconditional versus conditional transfers from the central government, for example. Uh, when and under what circumstances we should use which, I think it's a highly debated topic already. And I think it's generally agreed by the academia as well as policymakers that to the extent possible that unconditional transfers would be preferred if conditions are right. And this is a big if. It could be things like capacity that we talked about, capacities at local level. It could be the existence, for example, existence of any kind of meaningful downward accountability mechanism in place at local level. Uh, so to the extent possible, we would, uh, I think the policymakers and academia would recommend unconditional transfers to the local governments. But we also acknowledge that not always these conditions are in place. And at times, and I think it is still the case in many countries, including Thailand, that the policymakers in the end opt for conditional transfers. And that actually also provides incentives for the local governments to undertake specific activities that is in line with the national priorities. Uh, in terms of conditional cash transfers, there could be different, also different arrangements for this type of transfers. It could be input-based vis-a-vis, say, output-based conditionalities. Input-based is basically, for example, number of students. I think it's a simple and straightforward way to allocate resources based on the number of students uh, each, say, province or district or school has. But the downside of that is it doesn't really take into account the performance, the output, how well, for example, the students are doing. So, for example, in some countries, for example, in the Philippines, a the education resource allocation also takes into account the number of graduating students in addition to the number of total students in schools. So that is a way to ensure, okay, schools, the education administrators at local level do have a financial incentive to make sure that students perform well and they do pass the necessary exams in order to graduate from the school. So that is the kind of mechanism that we can put in place in order to make sure that the transfer scheme provides the right incentives to encourage performance and to achieve the output level objectives of the policymakers. Then we can have matching or non-matching arrangements. I think the general consensus that is that the matching, any kind of matching would provide incentives for the local government to in resource mobilization and also in making sure that they are committed to deliver the policy objectives of the central government as well. Because once you have financial commitment, then your accountability is different than otherwise, and you get more serious than otherwise in delivering whatever mandate that you are supposed to deliver with that sort of financial resources that is assigned to you. Uh, so in conclusion, uh, we would, as um, policy makers or development practitioners, we tend to believe that input-based conditionalities is often intrusive and unproductive. And to the extent possible, we advocate for the use of output-based conditionality because that can not only advance the grantor's objective, but also that can preserve the local autonomy to the extent possible. All right, this is a example of financing arrangement between the central and provincial governments for education-related expenditure. And this is example from China. So as you can see, basically the principle is the more advanced, the less you will get from the central government allocation. But the different types of services or the local government responsibilities would have a different percentage of subsidy from the central government. And in a way, it is relatively simple to implement, and it's very straightforward and predictable. Uh, I'm not necessarily advocating that other countries should use the same type of arrangement, but this, to me, the point really I want to highlight here is the simplicity here, uh, particularly the identification or the categorization of provinces into five different categories, rather than really using, for example, taking into account directly the different development levels of each province. And given the number of the provinces, then the whole scheme becomes really complicated if we do it that way. Uh, Now, lastly, I want to highlight that when we talk about education spending or investment in human capital development, it is actually we are having it the return is highest when we are children, we are very young. uh, the return dramatically reduces, as you can see, actually after regular schooling age. So that means the best investment should be made even before the regular school age. Therefore, I think that is a very important justification for UNICEF along with other stakeholders to really advocate for increased government spending in preschool programs, including early childhood development programs, because it's when the efficiency is highest. And when we have the highest efficiency, uh, it's most likely that we achieve the best outcome in terms of equity as well. Because if we can ensure that children at the very earliest age do get prepared for equal outcomes later in their life in the most efficient way financially, then it is most likely that they will achieve equitable outcomes in the future down the road in their life. Therefore, uh, efficiency, sorry, maybe we should do a bit editing here. I don't think I'm really talking the best way I can here. But I want to make a point that early childhood development and investment in early childhood development is possibly the most efficient spending that we may have in education that will generate the best equitable outcomes for children down the road in their life. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you again to the organizers for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Junfan. And last but not the least, of course, the next speaker is Associate Professor Dr. Chayut from Thammasat University. Dr. Chayut, the floor is yours.
Hi, the Thailand Equitable Education Fund to conduct the program intervention on how to reduce the inequality in education. So my talk today will go roughly by beginning about the context of education system in Thailand. So we have a kind of understanding about how the school finance system in Thailand works. And then we're gonna go to how we conduct the conditional cash transfer program and how we have ability to target the extreme poor children in the school system. And then we would conclude with something that we learned from this program and something that we need to do for to making forward. Okay. Um, the back 20 years ago, the Thailand had a big the education reform, and which is the one of the objective of the reform is try to provide the education for all, which is at that time is about 12 year free of education with some kind of desired quality. And later on, that we kind of step up the our objective to the 15-year free education program. So um, since then, I think the spending on education sector have consumed large amount of money. So each year we spend about top 20% of the government spending, the highest among many ministers. Okay, so the way the government the subsidize the public school is through the what we call the per student basis. So we have a kind of the school funding formula that try to allocate the operating cost to school, but this funding formula do not include the personnel cost, which mean the teacher salary. Okay. Um, as you know, the education sector is quite labor intensive, since the personal cost will take up about 75% of all the basic education budget. Okay, so here is kind of diagram to show you that during the last 10 years, okay, even we have the increase the education budget by 200%, but the portion of the education budget that are addressing the poverty issue is quite low. Okay, so we see that this kind of the per student subsidy for the school operation um, quite favor the bigger school. Okay, so it means that a lot, just a small portion of this funding, it will go to the student need or to try to compensate for the difference among the size and geographical differences. Okay, so the, in reality, we see a large number of the small public schools which are underfunded, and these schools are serving about roughly 1 million students, which is most of them kind of come from the family which under the poverty line. Okay. So far, during the last 10 years, we have a strong evidence to show that the learning gap or the learning outcome between large and small schools are bigger. We could see the very large learning gap between the school in the rural and urban areas. Okay. At beginning, we start with a program to have the free education for all. But in reality, we know that households with poor income still have to spend part of their income on education. And if we compare to the richer family, the poor families spend more. Okay, and this is quite unequal. Okay, here's the picture that we see that um, on the right of this picture, we see that we have a roughly about 1.2 million poor students in the formal school system. This is about the 20% out of the 5 million. Okay, and on the left diagram, that we see that there's still uh, a large number of the students living out of the school system. We call that out of school children. I think a couple years ago, the Thailand have the new constitution and also the momentum for the education reform. And inequality is put to the as a top priority among the policy goals, and that the new constitution led to create the equitable education fund. Okay, this fund is founded in order to solve the three the goal. One, you try to support poor and disadvantaged population. Secondly, and try to improve the equity in education. And thirdly, it try to promote the teacher quality and efficiencies. Okay, that's about the, right now we are talking about kind of 1.5 year old the operating program by the Thailand Equitable Education Fund, and that about the conditional cash transfer program. So I think the cash transfer program is they're quite popular among many countries who try to help the poor family. So I think what we would like to share with you how we conduct the program. Okay, so I think to try to collect the data from 200 for about the 2 million students, that is not very easy, right? So the one thing that we try to do is try to use the kind of the advanced technology by creating the application on the mobile phones, and then we give that the mobile application for free for the teacher to collect the data. So in Thailand, the public school teacher have to visit student home. So the data is they collected by the school teacher is pretty much uh, um, uh, similar to what many countries do. It's called the proxy mean test. So the basic we try to check the income household. In Thailand right now, the poverty line for income household is about the 3,000 baht per month per person. Okay. Instead of we try to ask them to report his income or the household income, so we check with something that we can see and verify. So those are the tangible thing. Like for example, the household do household have some dependent in in the family or in that household? For example, if there are elders, some disabled, or some unemployment person. Okay, or we asking about how many assets like car and land and the household appliances that a household have. Okay, then we use that kind of data and the making to kind of the screening the is the relative poorer household. Okay, and that's what we did by using what we call proxy mean test. Okay, here is the kind of a picture to show you what we did with this application. So the application will take a snapshot of the poor students, the house. Actually, we took both outside and inside. Okay, and so but this one is a very substantial evidence to show whether you are from really poor household or not. Okay, and not only did we do that data collection, we also want to have the community to participate in the way we conduct poverty screening. So we have the village leaders to help us to approve, because sometimes the poverty can be not also obvious from the eye of the outsiders. Okay, and also at the end we also have the school committee or school board to help us to do some kind of final validation, and also ability to sanction whether if we have the wrong information. And once we have that validation, so the money will be transferred. And one thing that is also very uh, nice about the program is the money will be transferred directly to the family bank account. Okay, for those families who don't have the bank account, the money will transfer indirectly to school first and then pass to the household families. So I think the what we did is so far we collect the information about the 2 million kids, and try to subsidize only about the 700,000 kids among this group. So I think the CTT program here is quite, in a way, very cost efficient in that try to reach this particular the extreme poor kid. and as a way that to stop the kid to drop out or leaving school early than they should. Okay, another thing that what we try to do is that we also try to look at the part of students who are already left school, or we call that the out of school children. And I think what we try to do is try to first try to find them first where they are, okay, and find what they need. And then what we try to do is try to what would be the right program to address their need. Okay, and this has to be done by the area-based intervention type. Um, and because this is a quite costly, why? Because those students are not concentrated in certain area, but they are quite widespread in many areas, in many locations. That's why this program would be quite a challenging for the EAF to, to do in the near future. I think that I think we have the couple reasons that we learned from the success of the Thailand Equitable Education Fund to be able to address or to help about the almost 1 million kids in just 1 year. Okay, I think the first thing we have to kind of give the credit to the policy maker the who try to make sure that uh, putting the equity, the goal, have to be among the top priorities. Okay, not just about the make sure that government must have enough the adequate resource, okay, to ensure the free education and with certain type of quality. Okay, and when we have that the policy priority, I think it's quite obvious that now the system have to divert the resource or to toward the people with higher need. Okay, and that requires there be a bigger change in the system. So CTT will be not be able to do that, but I think the CTT program so far can show the and a very good example that how we can achieve the this policy objective. Okay, I think the next thing is that the program, okay, can be success because there's many stakeholders, including policymakers, aware that this type of program have a quite high return to investment. Okay, that so far that we already show that um, it is quite costly. Okay, it is quite costly to leave those kids behind. So in a way, if we can divert the resources, which is we have plenty in the system to address the need of the higher needs group, that will be the quite a um, uh, good investment. Okay. The next thing about the nice about the program that we have here is that um, the program the run through the very strong the evidence. Okay, when we try to do the poverty screening and targeting, we have kind of the concrete um, information about the individual student, and with the individual the information that we have from the field, they allow the program to be monitored and evaluated. Okay, and this quite very important because many the education program in Thailand uh, are not well monitored and are not well evaluated. Okay, I think there's some kind of thing that we need to continue to do it, and which is the one of the among the final goal on to provide the resource equity is try to reduce the learning gap or we call the outcome gap among the group of students. Okay, but try to achieve the or try to narrow down the outcome gap is quite very difficult. So in a word, the CTT program will be not enough to do it. Okay, because the I mean the disparity of the learning it comes from the overall resource distribution. It's not just about the money that we held into the certain poor families, because the quality in learning also come from the quality of teacher, how we deploy teacher. So the to go to that this step, I think the it kind of the uh, we have to look at the how the we can create more equitable allocation system, which is not just at the central government, but we want to have the kind of ecology of equity down into the school and the district area. And this is something that we haven't done this. Okay. Another challenge that I think that we must also uh, do it try to uh, extend and scaling up the some kind of quality measure for those the out of school children. Okay, and we already uh, say that because it's quite okay, very difficult to identify them, find them, and and to make them to make the remedial education or scholarship program in order to make them come back to the school system would be quite costly. Okay, and I think that at the moment the Thailand the Equitable Education Fund does not have that capacity. So maybe we need a bigger, more collaboration in order to try to finish, try to achieve this goal. Okay, all right. Then thank you very much. And that's all for my presentation today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tayut. Thank you very much to all our 4 distinguished speakers for sharing their fascinating experiences and valuable knowledge with us today. And thank you very much for the participants for your participation in this session.